The Balvano disaster is one of the deadliest rail disasters of all time, and yet there was no collision, no derailment, no explosion. In fact, there was no crash of any kind. So the question becomes, how did so many people die on a train that never crashed? The train in question, the 8017 Naples to Potenza service, left the outskirts of the city on the evening of March 2, 1944. This wasn't a conventional passenger train, far from it. In fact, it was a freight train consisting of mostly empty boxcars and some flatbed wagons carrying timber for bridge repairs. So what was it doing with hundreds of people on board? Well, southern Italy in 1944 was a shattered wreck of what it had been. The Allies had pushed the Axis powers up into the north, where Mussolini was running his last gasp puppet government, the Italian Social Republic, but the south, although liberated, was in a real mess. Cities such as Naples had suffered air raids and bombings, and civilians lived in the midst of just shattered infrastructure. Against this backdrop of extreme hardship and suffering, a thriving black market sprang up. This wasn't just profiteering, although that did occur, it was more like a substitute system that had been born in the absence of any organised effort. In this brutal new reality, civilians were forced to move, constantly shuttling between the bombed-out cities and the rural towns and countryside to barter for food and basic supplies. Needless to say, the running of passenger trains wasn't high on the list for the Allied forces. The railways were prioritised for military use, and passenger services, if they did exist at all, were sporadic, unreliable, and it was very difficult to get a ticket. As a result, desperate people crowded onto whatever transport was available, and the authorities kind of turned a blind eye, knowing that these civilians had precious little in the way of any other options. So by the time the 8017 service left the outskirts of Naples on that March evening, it was already carrying hundreds of unauthorised passengers and was almost certainly at, or maybe even above, its acceptable working weight limit. The train itself comprised 2 steam locomotives and a total of 47 cars. Like I said, mostly box freight cars and flatbeds, but some older reports do mention 4 basic passenger coaches and a guard van at the very back. 2 engines were needed to pull this train, as their route would take them through the mountainous Apennine region, a spine of unforgiving terrain comprising steep valleys and rocky ridges. In this region, long tunnels, short bridges and steep gradients were the order of the day when travelling by train. Also, due to wartime restrictions, the engines were burning an imported low-grade Yugoslav coal, often a mix of lignite and poor-grade bitumen-rich coal, higher in moisture, and it produced lots of smoke when burned, but provided less energy than regular coal. So by now you can probably see where this is going. You've got a heavy train overloaded with hundreds of people who weren't officially meant to be there, 2 steam locomotives burning low-grade smoky fuel, heading into a mountainous region where steep track gradients and long tunnels are common. The journey would have been long and uncomfortable, punctuated by many stops and delays, as the train was forced to halt for other military traffic en route. And none of this would have surprised anyone on the train, it was par for the course in wartime Italy. At just before 1 o'clock in the morning, the train approached Balvano, a small town deep in the Apennines. The coastal plain had been left far behind, the train had been climbing for some hours, and they were well up into the rugged interior terrain. The train halted at the small Balvano Risigliano station, the last stop before entering the valley that led to the 2-kilometre-long Galleria dell'Armi, a single-track curved tunnel that emerged on the northern side at Bellamuro. The Galleria dell'Armi wasn't a particularly long tunnel by Italian standards, but it did have all the ingredients for bringing about the terrible tragedy that was about to unfold. The Galleria was just under 2 kilometres of single-track, narrow tunnel. Poorly ventilated, it had a constant uphill gradient to boot. And it was damp. Wet and slippery track was common inside tunnels like this. These factors, combined with the overweight train and weak, smoky coal, were about to come together to produce one of the world's deadliest and most bizarre rail accidents. Just after 1 a.m, the 8017 left Balvano Risigliano station and headed out through the first short tunnel. Then it continued north up the valley towards the Galleria dell'Armi, which would take it through the mountain and then on to the next station, Bellamuro. Assistant Station Master Giuseppe Salonia watched it go, then settled back to wait for the notification that it had arrived at Bellamoro and the track through the mountain was clear. But that notification never came. He inquired to the whereabouts of the train but just received news from Bellamoro that the 8017 was running over 2 hours late. Somewhat perturbed, he asked the fireman on duty to warm up the small engine they had on the siding as he wanted to go up the valley and see for himself. As they were doing this, a figure waving a red warning light stumbled out of the tunnel mouth. It was Michele Palo, the brakeman from the 8017, and he ran over to the two men, shouting, "They're all dead. They're all dead." Palo told the two men what had happened, that the train had come to a standstill just as his guard van, the rearmost car, was about to enter the Galleria dell'Armi. At first he wasn't worried. Unexpected stops like this were commonplace and there'd been no emergency signal from the drivers. He busied himself with trying to keep warm as it was a cold night. However, after 2 hours with no movement and no news, he decided it was time to go and have a look. As he left the guard van and entered the tunnel, he saw people lying on the tunnel floor, seemingly asleep. He looked into the next wagon, and again he saw people slumped or sprawled, seemingly fast asleep. He shook one man but got no response. He listened. There were no sounds, no shouts, no calls or talking, just the faint chuff of the engines coming from deep inside the tunnel. Unnerved, he turned and he fled back down the track. By now it was after 5 in the morning and Giuseppe Salonia, having heard Palo's strange tale, decided to go up the track and see for himself. All he knew for sure was that the 8017 had not arrived at Bellamoro, and it was his job to find out why. As he approached the Galleria, he saw the guard van stuck out of the back of the tunnel, just as Palo had said, and upon entering the tunnel, his worst fears were confirmed. As far as he could tell, everybody on that train was dead. By dawn, the rescue services, a mix of army volunteers and locals, had arrived at the Galleria and were removing bodies, hundreds of them. Eventually, the track was cleared of corpses and the 8017 was backed out of the tunnel, and with its macabre cargo, it returned to Balvano station, where the deceased passengers were laid out in rows along the platform. Amongst these rows, rescuers saw that there was some movement. A few souls had not succumbed completely. From around an estimated 600 passengers, there were maybe 80 survivors, and some of them were apparently suffering from brain damage. The number killed, the one that historians generally agree on, is 521 fatalities. Some sources quote 517 and others over 600. Whatever the actual figure, it's by far and away Italy's deadliest rail disaster. Due to the need to keep the wartime supply lines open, the track was reopened later that day. The bodies were hastily buried in large pits dug out alongside the railway line. Apparently some were later exhumed and reburied in Balvano cemetery, but like much of this story, the actual details are lost in the fog of war. Indeed, the scale of the disaster was not widely known until long after the war, not until 1951, when Time magazine ran an article on the Italian death train and brought the story to the attention of the Italian public due to the sheer number of casualties that were involved. Now, there is hardly any eyewitness testimony to what happened, as almost everyone involved was killed, and those who did survive were either mentally incapacitated or unwilling to give statements to the police due to the nature of their presence on that train, i.e. black marketeering. But we can make an educated guess as to what happened. What follows is reconstructed from oral testimony where it was available and second-hand written accounts. Station Master Giuseppe Salonia remembered that the chief engineer of the 8017, a Signore Gigliani, asking his fireman, Rosario Barbato, to load up the furnace in preparation for the steep gradient ahead. However, something happened in the Galleria dell'Armi to make the train grind to a halt. Possibly icy rails, possibly the sheer weight of the train combined with the poor quality coal. Whatever it was, once the train had come to a standstill, it couldn't get going again. Gigliani and Barbato probably tried in vain to move up and out of the tunnel, pushing the engines hard to get traction, but the wheels were just spinning on slippery tracks. One engine, two engines, it didn't make any difference, they weren't going anywhere. Gigliani and Barbato were almost certainly overcome by the fumes and would have collapsed before having time to shut off the engines, which then continued to churn steadily with no one conscious to stop them. Most of the passengers were very likely drowsy or asleep already, as it was past 1 in the morning, and they wouldn't have noticed the insidious creep of the carbon monoxide that was building up in the tunnel. With the rear of the train blocking what little fresh air could have come into the Galleria, the whole tunnel had effectively become a long, narrow gas chamber, and the occupants of the train its unwitting victims. It's likely that most passengers would have been unconscious in as little as 10 to 20 minutes and dead in under an hour. Some passengers must have realised that something was going wrong, as bodies were found lying on the tracks underneath the train and at the tunnel sides, but the majority of over 500 men, women and children just quietly succumbed to the poisonous gas, completely unaware that anything was even wrong. Today, the Balvano disaster remains one of the least known mass casualty rail disasters in Europe. Its scale was overshadowed by the fact it happened during the Second World War, when thousands were dying every day. The railway line and the Galleria dell'Armi still exist and are in use on the same line, pretty much unchanged since that tragic night in March 1944. There is a very modest memorial in Balvano itself. There are no names given, as almost all of the victims were never identified. Even in Italy, the disaster is still relatively obscure. It's mostly remembered by railway enthusiast circles and by YouTube disaster channels like this one.